Hello and welcome back to the channel where we make things just because. Today I'm going to be working on dealing with the shoe storage situation that we have in our hallway. At the moment, this is the situation we have where we have a small shoe rack immediately as you open our front door. And because this is open storage, it doesn't matter what we do, it just always looks messy and there isn't enough room for everything. And because our house is so close to a major road, everything is always dusty and it's just so hard to keep this area clean. So I want to replace this with a shoe cupboard as opposed to a rack where we can close the doors and everything's tucked away neat and tidy. So I had a look online at things that were in our budget and that I liked, and what I found was not great. It was a bunch of really cheap, flimsy looking cabinets. A lot of them had were fake wood, so they weren't, they weren't real wood. They were just that laminate stuff, and I don't like it because it's so hard to make it match with anything. And I just really struggled to find something I liked. But I did find this cabinet, which is lovely, and it's made of real oak, and it would have matched our floors, and it's great. But it was like £350, and that was way over what I actually wanted to pay for shoe storage. So after taking a look around all of my options, DIYing something seemed to be the only real option. So, as always, I took to YouTube and Pinterest, and what I found was everybody doing these IKEA IVAR hacks. So I figured that's what I would do too. But as with all of my projects, we immediately hit a road bump, and it turned out that IKEA is not currently stocking this IVAR cabinet. And I waited for weeks and weeks, and I kept waiting for them to restock it, and it was just never coming back in. So then I decided that I would attempt to build a cabinet from scratch. So I started pricing up the plywood I would need and the tools I would need, and it was becoming really expensive really fast. Luckily, as I was doing this, one of these IVAR cabinets became available on the Facebook Marketplace, so I immediately messaged the lady who was selling it and got it, so I was super happy. And let's be honest, I have zero woodworking skills, and the chances of me actually being able to build a cabinet from scratch is very, very low. So anyway, let me show you what I actually did. So this is the IVAR cabinet. This is the one I got and I brought home. I also picked up some legs from Amazon, and I went to good old B&Q and picked up a whole bunch of these 15 by 25 millimeter strip wood pieces. But before we go any further, I just want to insert a little rant here. Whenever you go online and you find these IKEA hacks, everyone's like, oh, look at this super cheap IKEA hack, it's going to change your life. These hacks aren't actually that cheap. While it's considerably cheaper than the cabinet that I liked, the £350 cabinet, it was like the cabinet which I bought secondhand, but was still 30 quid. The legs were 20 quid, and 60 odd pounds worth of wood later, we were over the £100 budget that I'd set for myself before we'd even bought the other bits and pieces that we needed to put this all together. So it's not cheap. Just putting it out there. It's not cheap. So anyway, the day I started this project was, I'm pretty sure, the only sunny day that we have had so far this year. So I immediately got started with cutting my wood pieces because I wanted to be able to do this outside to save my dining room from, the sawdust hell. And these pieces were really easy to cut down. I just marked how long I wanted the pieces. I used a mitre box to make sure that all of my cuts were going to be straight and square. I just lined it up and cut away. This did take a little bit longer than I had anticipated, but wasn't too bad overall. And I also cut a whole bunch of these little wood pieces to use as spacers. Then, in good old English fashion, it wasn't so sunny anymore and it started raining, so we had to take everything inside. So it was at this point where I cleaned up the cabinet. I gave it a good clean with a damp cloth. I went round and I sanded down the fronts and the outsides to get rid of any residues, especially on the top of one of the doors on the cabinet. There was a discoloured part, so that needed to be sanded away. And then I gave it another quick wipe down to get rid of the dust. I also at this point went through and sanded down all the ends of the pieces of strip wood where I'd cut them, just to make sure there weren't any jagged edges, because my cutting skills were not 100% here, and just make sure they were all clean and tidy. I also removed the doors at this point so that I could work on them a little bit later. Now at this point I needed to make some decisions about where I wanted my wood pieces. While I was at B&Q, I tried to select as many pieces as possible that didn't have blemishes and knots in them, but that's just not always possible. So while most of my pieces didn't have those things, I had a couple that did, and I had to work out where they were going to be seen on the cabinet. Once I had decided where everything was going and everything was cleaned up and ready to go, it was time to glue them down, and this part was terrifying. I still hadn't decided whether I wanted to paint or stain or what with this cabinet yet, so I didn't want to put a whole bunch of nails in it, but I knew that once it was glued down, there was no going back from that, so hence the terrifying. However, the glue did work out really well. I didn't have too many problems, and it all held together beautifully. One thing I did do is when I was placing these pieces down, I made sure that they were all as level as possible along the top, because this is the part that was going to be seen the most. So I used just a separate piece of wood just to get those all lined up. So once I had all these pieces glued down and clamped into place to dry, I moved on to the legs. So I bought a set of legs off of Amazon, and they just needed to be assembled and then placed onto the bottom of the cabinet. So to assemble these legs, the first thing I needed to do was work out where the mounting brackets would be attached to the legs. Luckily, in the making of the legs, a centre point was still visible on the top of the leg, so I just used this to work out where the plate needed to go from there, making sure that they were just all the same. I needed to drill some pilot holes for the screws into the legs. Now, I don't have a fancy work table with a vise, and this is definitely not the safest way to drill holes in legs, but it worked for me, and so here we are. But I do not recommend that any of you try this at home. Then I needed to work out where I wanted the legs to be on the cabinet, so I just flipped the cabinet upside down and popped them on roughly where I wanted them. From this point, I measured one of the legs and then transferred those markings and measurements to the rest of the cabinet so that I knew they'd all be in the same place on the four corners. I then drilled another few pilot holes to actually attach the legs with the mounting brackets onto the cabinet, popped these in all four corners, and legs were done. Here's how they looked. So moving back to our doors, once the glue was all dried, I can move on to the next step. As I said earlier, when I was putting these strips on and gluing them into place, I made sure that the tops were all even, and this left the bottom slightly uneven because, again, not good with the wood cutting, so although I measured them out, they weren't all perfectly the same length. But this was something I knew I could pretty much easily remedy just by sanding the bottoms down, and that is what I did. And this worked perfectly on the first door. However, on the second door, one of the strips was slightly too short, which I didn't realise while I was gluing them down, and there was nothing I could do to fix it at this point. So I sanded all the ones down that were too long and left this one because it's at the bottom, and the reality is nobody's really going to see it. So at this point, I just popped the doors back on, and this is where we hit another speed bump. Once the cabinet was on its new legs and the extra wood had been added to the front of the doors, the cabinet was too heavy, or the doors were too heavy, so when you opened the doors, the cabinet fell forward. Now this is another thing that all of these YouTubers with their DIY hacks won't tell you. It just bugs me that they don't, but they don't. So I'm telling you that this cabinet, once you do all that stuff to it, the doors will be too heavy and it will tip forwards. Now this isn't really a problem because it will be secured to the wall anyway, but if you are expecting it to be freestanding, it won't be. So let's go and see how it looked. As you can see, I haven't put any kind of finish on it yet, but you could paint it or stain it or even just put a clear coat on. But I can't decide. So I am going to wait because I'm going to have my hall stairs and landing redecorated soon. And once I have that done, I will then make a decision about what colour or finish I want it to be. As this is my first real woodworking project, I am incredibly happy with it. And who knows, maybe one day I will have the confidence to build that cabinet from scratch without fearing for my life. But I am really, really happy with what I did manage to achieve with this one. So thank you guys for watching today, and I will see you again soon. Goodbye.